Hey there, how's it going? Welcome back to my Master Your Mysteries of the Multiverse podcast channel. And thanks for being here, and thanks for being a fan. I wanted to update you on some of my most recent thinking about how cryptids and Bigfoot are able to create some of these very strange electromagnetic effects. If you take a look at the literature, you go to any events, you talk to people who've seen Bigfoot or other types of creatures. Some people don't think of Bigfoot exactly as a cryptid. The other types of creatures and animals might be of a different lineage, and Bigfoot being more human-like. But in any case, some of the EM effects are very interesting and very strange. And it's something that I've been, working on for several years. I mentioned it in my book, Dark Matter Monsters, which has been a very popular book about this subject. I think maybe one of the only books ever written so far to look into the EM effects of some of these creatures in Bigfoot. And I recently published on my newcrystalmind.com blog and my Patreon page, Dark Matter Mysteries on Patreon, an article, and it's Bigfoot's EM effects, silence, cold, and dark matter. And that's what we're talking about here. And of course, I'm always interested in, your ideas about this, but here's my thinking about this and how it relates to what's called structured water, why water may be a very important aspect of this, and a fourth phase of water that has electromagnetic properties. So in this article that I just recently wrote, I'm just going to kind of summarize it for you. There are basically three main effects that I'm interested in explaining here, and we can just leave it to Bigfoot at the moment, but it applies to other types of mysterious creatures as well. So the first thing, that people often say, and you can see this in these accounts that you hear about on any of the podcasts or in books that are collections of stories of people's encounters, is this sudden silence that seems to pervade the area. A kind of a deadening of sound, be it in the forest or whatever it is. But, people often say that the crickets and the bird chirps went away. And this, by the way, that has been reported around ball lightning too. But that's one of the things that people notice is it becomes eerily silent. And then secondly, this inexplicable cold that comes onto the area, this chill feeling, right? People say it just became cold. Sometimes they start seeing a sudden fog. Hikers will say they were hiking along and all of a sudden they just came to this wall of fog and it got cold right before they encountered a Bigfoot. So there's these changes in temperature. And then there's this other feature that people often describe around Bigfoot, which is that it looks like blacker than black. Darker than the surroundings, darker than even the trees and leaves at night. Something about it seems to absorb light. And of course, there's a fourth interesting electromagnetic effect, which I don't mention in the articles, but it's kind of important too, which is this sudden camera and battery failure affecting cars too. I was just talking with Stan Gordon a few days ago. I made a mini video when Stan and I were talking about orbs. And I asked him a question off camera about his knowledge in Pennsylvania of people, encountering this effect on their cars around Bigfoot. And he told me a story that's in one of his earlier books of these people seeing a Bigfoot on the road and its arms were outstretched in front of it. And they went around it as they did. The engine sputtered, and the electrical system seemed to really go wonky. And it got better as they drove away. So there's weird kind of electrical effects on all types of batteries and electronics. So obviously, to me, this looks like some very interesting electromagnetic effects of these creatures, which, if you've been following my research at all, I consider them to be some sort of human relative from the distant past, some sort of other type of human. And, people have described them like Igor Burtsev, the Russian researcher, who I met in Bailey a couple of years ago at one of the Sasquatch Outpost conferences. And he said they had concluded in Russia that Bigfoot was a paranormal human, because of these sort of strange effects. And there are a lot more than these we're mentioning here, but I think for sake of simplicity, we'll just mention these 3 or 4. So I've been kind of wondering why you would get these effects. And when I first started looking into cold fusion about 10 years ago, what's now called low energy nuclear reaction, and I've learned a lot about this from the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, Bob Greenyer, and their YouTube channel. There often is this cold effect around cold fusion Leonard reactors, and the researcher Jean-Paul Biberian, who's presented at these ICCF conferences, International Conference for Cold Fusion. They've talked about their lab turning cold while this happened. I believe John Hutchinson, the Canadian, fractured metal sample experimenter attempting to replicate Nikola Tesla's work, also talked about this cold state. And other people have talked about how it feels kind of strange to be around these reactors. So, my thinking is that Bigfoot is able to recreate some of these condensed matter effects that seem particular to cold fusion Leonard reactors, but, amplified in a big way. So I've been wondering for a long time, how do you get to that type of state, which we call coherent matter, the 5th state of matter, where the particles have synchronized themselves with each other to create this sort of phase conjugation, this sort of coherency between the matter waves that make up our reality, like the Bose-Einstein condensate and other types of coherent matter systems, but at room temperature. And I've long thought it could have something to do with their ability to create some sort of cavitation using sound, sound vibration. Cavitation is one way to create coherent matter in water. And, people report these incredibly loud howls and shrieks and things that sound like Tyrannosaurus Rex combined with a pterodactyl or something like that. A scream howl that's louder than a freight train. But then the interesting thing about it is that someone maybe even a couple hundred feet away doesn't hear it. Various researchers have mentioned this, that they've heard these incredibly loud sounds coming from these creatures, and then they asked other people in the campground, hey, did you hear that? And the other people didn't hear it. So what that shows us is that there is a coherency to the sound, which is it's directional, like a laser beam. It's directional sound, like a laser. Some people have called it a phaser, a sound equivalent of a laser, which stands for, light, amplitude, stimulated emission of radiation. And the phaser is like an equivalent of that. And we know from research, into non-lethal military weapons, they've developed some of these sound weapons, and they project sound onto laser beams. So kind of different states of coherency kind of go together, and one sort of coherent system can stimulate another type of coherent system. Just think of a laser beam, if you want an example of coherency here. It's directional. It has that particular look to it that normal light, which is scattering in all directions, doesn't. That's coherent light waves. And the classical analogy of that is like murmurations of birds. When birds look like a wave moving through the sky, and they're all coordinated, and it's really beautiful to watch them. We often see this in the U.S., like in the Midwest, these huge swarms of birds in this wave-like pattern, or schools of fish too. That's kind of an analogy of coherent matter. So I recently had a kind of a breakthrough about this when I started reading Gerald Pollack's book, The Fourth State of Water. I heard Gerald Pollack talk at the 2015 Society for Scientific Exploration meetings. I think it was around then. It was in D.C., Washington, D.C. And he talked about this fourth state of water that seemed to explain a lot of water's very strange properties. You know, why ice is slippery and why the solid form of water takes more space up than its liquid form, and why clouds seem to clump together, why they even rise in the sky and stay up there, and other really strange aspects of water that are not easily explainable from thermodynamics, like why a hot cup of tea or coffee kind of has these wisps coming off it, or why you even get bubbles in boiling water. Why does water seem to have this self-organizing property? And in Pollack's interpretation, water has an electromagnetic phase. And this is something you and I were not taught about in school. We were only taught that there are three states of matter. But when you consider that water could have an electromagnetic state, which Pollack calls exclusion zone water or easy water, it sort of makes sense even from his point of view. This is actually a state of water where the water molecules kind of rearrange themselves. Instead of H2O, you have H3O2. And they stack themselves like hexagonal plates, a little offset from each other, millions of layers thick. And when they're like that, they kind of have a thickness. The water has a thickness very much like what you'd see in Jell-O. And that's one of the mysteries that Pollack's interested in explaining here, is how does Jell-O, which is almost entirely water, how does that stay together in your bowl before you eat it or something? Why does something like Jell-O stay together? Why do the joints in your bones, between your bones, work so well? It's because water has this other state where it has an extreme level of lubricity and cohesion. And it can charge itself. This is the important take-home point. It can charge itself from radiant energy. Yeah, that type of radiant energy, infrared energy, called heat energy. Nikola Tesla was interested in radiant energy generated from his pulse discharge generators and so forth. And so in this fourth state, the water can charge itself from sunlight or even from incident radiant energy. Just any old random infrared energy that's around can charge up easy water and convert it to what? Electricity. And Pollack gives this example of these like deep sea, I think he called them brine eels or something. It's in the book. And by the way, this book is really definitely worth getting, The Fourth Phase of Water, because it's filled with, the subtitle is Beyond Solid Liquid Vapor. It's filled with these beautiful, it's so well illustrated. Every page has pictures on it. So there's no way you're going to miss getting the points of this. Really good illustrations that show us how this radiant energy interacts with water, the molecular structure of this fourth state of water, how it charges like a battery. And I got to tell you one interesting thing is that he said he invited, I think it was a researcher named G. Ling, to University of Washington, where he works. And Ling was talking about this sort of type of water. Back then it was called polywater. And Ling was a very controversial figure, believing that science had mistakenly relied completely on thermodynamics and was ignoring electromagnetism, which, by the way, is not new. Even Faraday and Maxwell had a huge amount of blowback against these ideas, which we now accept as self-evident. But when they were proposed, they were considered strange. And the Newtonians kind of fought against it. Well, this is still going on. This fight is still going on within something like the study of water or bioengineering. And one of Pollack's colleagues told him that it could damage Pollack's career to invite this Ling academic to UW just to give a talk. Can you imagine? Just talking about electromagnetic states of water. We're not talking UFOs and Bigfoot or cryptids here, crop circles or remote viewing. We're talking about water. This is how much resistance there can be to, new ideas. So Pollack's point of view here is that biological organisms can have a lot of this easy water, structured water inside them and charge themselves from the sun or even at the bottom of the ocean, which would support animals down there where there's no light and there's no heat or anything, and they're still able to exist. The conventional explanation being that these animals are getting chemicals from volcanic vents. But Pollack believes they're just absorbing this radiant energy that's, around any time you have motion. So what we're talking about is a type of self-organizing water. And this is something, by the way, I studied in my graduate career in sociology. When I was getting my PhD, I was looking at chaos theory and fractals. And there was this researcher at the time, Ilya Prigogine, who had written this book with Isabel Stengers called Order Out of Chaos. It's no longer in print, and it looks like the paperback copies are pretty expensive now. But that Order Out of Chaos book really affected me back then, because it showed us that in our reality, they're self-organizing structures. It's not just this one-way path towards entropy. There is this far from equilibrium structures in biology and living systems, and this idea we have from thermodynamics that everything basically goes towards, I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but goes towards disorder. That's just a limitation of 1800s thinking, that there's other ideas, and the advent of personal computers and computers that people could experiment on showed us mathematically you could create these self-organizing structures. One of them, even just from chemistry, was called the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. And if you go to newcrystalmind.com, you can see what that looks like. It's like a chemical clock where you combine two chemicals together and they start pulsating in this rhythmic way, which is a type of far from equilibrium order. There's this spontaneous type of order. So applying that, to what we're looking at here, it just shows us that electromagnetics could have a much bigger impact than we're aware of. Okay, it's not just in electronic devices that we're familiar with and radio waves and different types of radiation from light through sound all the way up to X-rays and gamma rays and so forth, that sort of electromagnetic spectrum that we were taught about in school. It might be that a lot of biological life has adapted to this sort of self-organizing property of water, and that it creates its own type of coherency, which in my view could lead to other types of coherency that we see in low energy nuclear reaction. Basically, the formation of plasmoids, as some people call them. Ken Shoulders' work in exotic vacuum objects, microball lightning, John Hutchinson, Dr. Alexander Parkhomov. Parkhomov, in his book Space, Earth, Human, which is definitely worth reading, Space, Earth, Human, translated by Bob Greenyer, goes into the effects of relic neutrinos and these sort of fractal dynamics that Parkhomov calls flicker noise. And he shows us that there are these cosmological cycles in chemical and biological systems, which has never been looked at by many scientists at all. This is actually considered to sort of be impossible. You would expect radioactive beta decay and other processes just to work on their own, but it seems to be affected, these processes, by where the Earth is in kind of cosmological cycles relative to the Milky Way and the Milky Way's position in the universe, which suggests that other particles coming into the Earth are affecting these processes. Dr. Takeaki Matsumoto also looked at sort of the spontaneous formations of what he called itonic clusters, these kind of clusters of atomic materials that he believed led to electronuclear collapse and micro ball lightning. And it was Matsumoto and some other researchers, Ed Lewis, who suggested this idea to Matsumoto that what we call cold fusion LENR is actually a type of micro ball lightning at an atomic scale. You know, what we see as ball lightning at, you know, with our own eyes, sometimes around thunderstorms and sometimes on its own. Air Force research from the 90s, J. Reese Roth, made the claim that 1 out of 20 Americans have seen ball lightning. So this is something you might have seen and not known what you're looking at. Well, the interesting point the breakthrough point that Matsumoto made is that it exists on a macro scale and a micro scale, on a atomic molecular level scale, causing this sort of collapse of particles and regeneration, electromagnetic transmutation, and so forth. And so if you have this type of coherency in water molecules, the same way that coherent light can be used with sound. And by the way, Pollack believes that structured water can be powered by sound as well. Pretty interesting. That these sort of coherent systems all go together. I call it cascading coherency. It's really the opposite of the whole point of view we have learned from thermodynamics and classical science for the past couple hundred years, which is everything tends towards entropy or kind of disorder, that heat just disperses, right? But from Pollack's point of view, and from the work of cold fusion LENR, there are other systems that naturally self-organize, aka prigogine, ilioprigogine, and lead to excess heat. And in Pollack's view, electricity within water, which would be harnessed by these organisms. By the way, there was a very important Russian scientist you might not have heard of, but he also did work in this. This is Simon Schnoll, who was a really brilliant scientist. Reading about him, he was active in the 50s and 60s in the Soviet Union. He authored over 200 papers, and he found that what seemed to be random chemical and biological processes are actually correlated with various earthly and galactic cycles, suggesting that there is no randomness, that everything is sort of interconnected in some interesting way. And that, cosmic energies do affect things on the earth. And so the real point about this is if you have this sort of negentropic effect and this sort of cascading coherency, it sounds to me very similar to what you see from Bigfoot creatures, because they could be using this structured water effect, charging themselves from the sun. I mean, they have all those hairs on them, right? And hairs can be receivers of electromagnetic energy. So they might be receiving radiant energy, they might be receiving other frequencies, and even sound, when they make those huge howling, scream, growl howls, you've heard them, in recordings. And by the way, a great movie to look at about this is A Flash of Beauty, Part 1, Bigfoot Revealed, and the sequel, A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot, which I'm featured in, which you can hear some of these howls and some of these sounds that witnesses recorded on their property. There's one guy, Jack, in the second movie, who you can hear some of the sounds of what he recorded, just the most incredible sounds. Well, I'm proposing, and as I did in Dark Matter Monsters, that these sounds might be driving other reactions in their body, and it could be driving this coherent water effect, which would allow them to have electromagnetic properties. And it would mean they might be acting like absorbers of energy, absorbers of electromagnetic energy. They might have gotten this down through just natural evolution over the millennia, where they absorb so much radiant energy, it causes the environment they're in to look a little darker, which some witnesses have reported, that everything looked darker when they were around these creatures. There might be a whole range of effects from their ability to organize electromagnetic waves through, this is one possibility, through structured water. And this would explain why they have these very powerful electromagnetic effects. They act to absorb energy from their environment. It's what powers them. And it would make the area feel colder because they're absorbing the radiant energy. Pollack says it's like photosynthesis for plants. I'm suggesting that Bigfoot is doing this type of photosynthesis for mammals, right? And they've got the hair structure and, their massive body weight, plenty of evidence. And of course, there's a big association between Bigfoot and water. You don't have that association between apes and water. Apes don't tend to really like water all that much, but Bigfoot do. You see them in the water all the time. And there's that wonderful book, Brushes with Bigfoot by J. Rob Alley, and his previous book, Rain Coast Sasquatch. Just plenty of examples, just even brushes with Bigfoot, all along the Canadian coast there, all the way up to Alaska and down to the Puget Sound, of cases of people seeing Bigfoot swimming and fishing and gathering sea life there along the coast. So Bigfoot and water really go along, and what this could mean is that they're able to use water in a structured way to create these self-organizing electromagnetic effects. And it doesn't stop there. The fact that we have, creatures at the sea bottom like giant tube worms or these brine eels that gather this sort of energy. One possibility where they can survive in total darkness in the complete cold down there by gathering this radiant energy. But maybe there's creatures on the surfaces of the earth that are doing this too. You and I do it also, and it's why probably it feels good to be in the sunlight and to be around radiant energy sources, right? Just sort of naturally feels good. And this could be why. But, if you look at some of these coherent matter effects, and this is something, I've talked about before, and Bob Greenyer's talked about it, Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, the Lockheed Martin coherent matter wave beam generating patent, which listed all of these ways to create coherent matter at room temperature with any type of particle using this type of synchronization to create synchronized particles. They were using one method with this sort of, I believe it was like an electron emitter through these kind of gates and channels to create this monochromatic effect where the particles are at the same frequency and temperature and so forth. But the net effect of all this is so similar to what we consider to be paranormal effects. They talk about this long distance communication, projecting energy, cloaking, invisibility. Does it sound familiar? Yes, it does. And they said it's all based on good old Aharonov Bohm effect, this ability in complete absence of electromagnetic signals, just with frequency to create non-local effects from one particle to another field, but with no EM effects at all. No EM measurable radiation. So once you have this sort of coherency, which might arise from gathering radiant energy, you can shift to this quantum. This is a quantum effect. It's not entanglement, particle entanglement like we've heard. The kind of traditional quantum entanglement between particles, just because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and so forth. It's more due to the fact that the AB effect relies on this ability of imaginary numbers to affect the phase of a particle, and it creates a physical effect. Imaginary numbers, vector potential, as it's called, can create a physical effect. So I'm just mentioning this to you. I know it's a lot of ideas here, but once you can kind of create any coherent system, whether it's water or lasers or phasers, you have access to a lot of very interesting quantum effects which can transcend the electromagnetic spectrum and sort of classical electromagnetic sort of interactions. You kind of move to another state where these quantum principles, like Aronoff-Bohm effect, can take over and create very interesting non-local spooky action at a distance, right? So that is really, to me, the main impact of looking at Pollack's fourth phase of water, is that anything that has water in it can have very interesting properties that allow that biological entity or that thing to store energy like a battery, absorb radiant energy, and really have a lot of power available to it. I mean, you've heard these stories of Bigfoot when people see them running up hills and they're really fast. I've heard people talk about this, witnesses, where they thought they were going to beat the Bigfoot driving up the hill, steep hills, right? And the Bigfoot beat them anyway, and they were in a very powerful SUV or something, or truck, and Bigfoot was still faster. Where do they get all that huge amount of energy? This might explain it. And it also explains these sort of weird and strange effects, because you get these around cold fusion Leonard reactors. People have reported, their credit cards and things like that being erased if they got too close to the reactor. And other types of effects like that, strange radiation. Well, you get those sort of effects around Bigfoot and the other cryptids. I mean, the dogmen, wolfmen type creatures, and other types of entities where people say that they just noticed some of these effects first: the silence, the sudden cold, battery effects, and so forth. So these exotic abilities that we've called paranormal, and I'm not saying explains all of it, may have something to do with this structured type of water. Why, when people are around these types of life forms, everything can look a little darker, the creature itself can look kind of blurry, which may have to do with other types of effects, permittivity, and so forth, that affect the speed of light and so forth. But this kind of blurriness, this kind of darkness, people, you read these accounts, people say that the Bigfoot looked like just a dark blob. And it wasn't just like the camera took a blurry picture. People have said they looked blurry. The creatures looked blurry. If you look at some of Stan Gordon's accounts in either his Creepy Cryptids series, which is up to volume 4 now, full of interesting accounts like this from Pennsylvania and surrounding areas, or his book Silent Invasion, the UFO Bigfoot connection, there are cases of people seeing Bigfoot partly invisible, like they could see part of the Bigfoot and then it was an invisible band, and they could see the body again in an invisible band. So it was kind of mixed visibility and invisibility. And coherent matter can create those types of effects. I Am Chuck Paranoff talked about these blurry effects on their reactors from this oscillating permittivity, which is created by their Mobius strip Leonard reactors and the microball lightning. And this is, by the way, we'll talk about this another time, but isn't that also what you get around Bigfoot and cryptids, are orbs? I mean, to me, this really just settles it. It's like case closed. You get orbs around Bigfoot. You see Bigfoot emerging out of orbs sometimes. Or if you want to watch a Flash of Beauty Paranormal Bigfoot, and you can get it on any streaming channel, there's excellent excerpts on YouTube from the movie witnesses. I'm in the movie, but there's many other witnesses directly to the phenomena. There are these witnesses from Oregon, Harold and Cody, that saw Bigfoot turn into a ball of light and then a glowing square before it shot away into the forest. So people have seen this, and it fits with what we understand about coherent matter generation and technology. And what I'm suggesting here is that Bigfoot has its own technology, which fits with what we know from Takeaki Matsumoto, Ken Shoulders, John Hutchinson, all these other effects from exotic vacuum objects, micro ball lightning, condensed plasmoids. There are different names for this phenomena. So that is my point of view on it, and I'm interested to hear what you think. I think thinking about structured water, the very fact that there's so much resistance to it within Pollack's academic community, and yet it just seems to make so much sense, and there's so much evidence for this fourth phase of water, that it really all kind of fits together. It's almost like for those biochemists, structured water is like cryptids for biologists. You know, it just seems weird, and the knee-jerk reactions to say, no, it can't be real. But you know, again, if we look through the history of science, this is what they said about electromagnetism on its own. And you and I are communicating through electromagnetism right now. So, you know, it exists. So it's very interesting that just science has these really long delays before it accepts even ideas that, for the most part, have been accepted for over 100 years, and we're still integrating them into these subdisciplines. So anyway, thanks for listening. Feel free to put your comments in the box if there's a comment area. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.